I think bias is an important word in all these considerations. Sometimes we get frustrated as Christian teachers or longtime believers, and we lay out the uh, rational evidence for the existence of God, evidence for the resurrection, evidence for the reliability of
Hmm.
the gospel as eyewitness testimony. But there is, like you said, this barrier in the way, this bias. In fact, what I'll be doing in October and November on Sunday mornings, I'll be starting a new series called "Asking for a Friend" in our church,
Yeah.
and the topics that we'll be covering will be um, objections that non-believers sometimes raise, or questions that
Mm.
non-believers sometimes raise to us, that sometimes have to kind of be addressed or dealt with before they'll consider,
Yeah.
the evidence. And so things like, how could a loving God, how could there be a loving God with the suffering that's going on in this world? Well, that is a perfectly legitimate question, but
Yep.
it's a subjective. There's more of an emotional component to that. I don't mean there's
Yeah.
nothing rational about it, but or how can a loving God send anyone to hell? Or how can you say that Jesus is the only way to God with all these different, religious understandings in the world? So I'll be trying to address some of those types of things. Now, with the practice that you have had, where you've taken the principles of police
Mhm.
investigation and you've applied them to the investigation of Christian truth claims, surely there is a kind of a process that investigators have to go through to learn how to sort of identify subjectivism and bias, and that's keeping them from really looking at the evidence.
Sure.
What
Now,
what Yeah. So what does an investigator do to make sure that he or she is not letting subjective things keep them from
mm,
seeing the evidence, and how can we translate that into investigating Christianity?
well, I think it's really hard when it's you're the person who is trying to examine your own heart on this issue of bias, right? It's hard because we're not impartial external observers of our own behavior or even of our own statements, our own thoughts. So it's really about constantly checking yourself and asking the question: if it wasn't for this thing, like miracles, would this be powerful in every other way? Is this the only reason why it's no longer powerful? Is this the only reason why it doesn't seem reliable? But when you're talking to friends, we have a voir dire process. We don't just put anybody on a jury. And we might have a huge room full of people, and we're going to pick a small percentage of those people to actually sit on the jury. Now, how are we judging who gets on the jury? Well, we're asking questions that will hopefully reveal biases. And so I think when you're talking to a friend about these kinds of issues, one of the clearest questions that a friend of mine, Frank Turek, and I always ask is, okay, if Christianity were true, would you follow Jesus? If it was true that Jesus rose from the grave and demonstrated his deity, would you worship him? Would you follow him as God? Would you trust in him as God? And you'll hear people say, well, no, I don't believe that's true. No, I'm saying as a thought experiment, imagine for a moment that it had been demonstrated evidentially in some way that that no one can deny. I get it that you don't believe that's the case, but imagine, just for the sake of the thought experiment, that it could be demonstrated that it's true. Would you submit to that truth? Would you follow Jesus? Would you submit to him as Lord? And you'll see that a lot of people, even in that thought experiment, will tell you no, I wouldn't. And then you know that this is no longer an issue of, well, do I keep on presenting rational evidences, or is there something else that is at play here beyond the rational, purely rational part of it? Now, I'm careful when I say that, because I don't mean to say that atheists are irrational. I'm not saying that. I was in that position for 35 years. What I'm saying, though, is that there may be something else at play. Remember, even though we present evidences in a criminal trial, and a jury eventually renders a verdict, well, it turns out that two jurors can disagree about the exact same presentation of evidence. This happens all the time. So there's clearly something else going on when people think about what's been presented to them before they render a decision. That's something outside of just the kind of objective nature of the evidence. And this is true for all of us. We have to be careful that we aren't allowing, it's usually these things. It's usually your likes and dislikes, your preferences. It is your personal history, your hopes, what you want to be true. Sometimes you've had a bad experience with something, and this is why we have to ask that question. If we've got a particular kind of defendant, the defense team is going to want to know, have you had a problem in the past with someone like this? Because I don't want you to drag that into the deliberations. Just because you had a bad experience with someone like this, I don't want you to be judging him unfairly because of your prior bad experience. This happens on both sides. So So this is part of what we have to ask and really think about when we're talking to our friends and family members. Is there something in their preferences, in the way they are naturally wired? I say naturally, but gifted from God. What are how do they think? How do they process things in their innate ability to process? Are they more logical by their nature? Are they more emotional by their nature? Are they more rebellious by their nature? So some of this is just wiring. And then, of course, it comes down to your biases, and it comes down to your past experiences. Well, all of those things I can't control. I can just present this case. But if nothing else, it helps me to have reasonable expectations about what might happen when I do present the case. And also, I do know that I was one of those people. But for the grace of God, who took and changed my nature so that I could hear fairly what was being said to me, if that doesn't happen first, then a lot of this is not going to work. You're going to be disappointed that this conversation that you've mastered in your head, these evidences that you've mastered, and you've read about all these evidences, and why is it I just offer this, and I offer the gospel clearly. I offer it the same way that somebody online does, that my pastor does, that someone like Franklin Graham or Billy Graham offer, whoever you think, Greg Laurie or Ray Comfort, whoever you think is a good evangelist, and you've watched all those videos and you do the same thing, and it's falling on deaf ears. Why is that happening? Well, I talk about this a little bit in Forensic Faith, but the idea basically is we have to become good at understanding the nature of our jury and selecting the right jury to present our case to. Sometimes the best thing you can do is pray for and model Christ for people who maybe aren't ready to hear the gospel in any other way.